Our gospel passage today has two sections to it with very different imagery. So that they don't get muddied together, I'm going to talk about the first half now and the second half during the sermon. In the first part of Luke chapter 13, Jesus points to two events in local news. Now, we don't know the historical context of these events, but we can take a good guess at what happened. The first is the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. There were a lot of tensions between Romans and the Galileans. It seems likely that Pilate's soldiers violently suppressed a group of Galilean worshippers, possibly revolutionaries, in their temple. Maybe it was a political riot, maybe it was police brutality, maybe it was an act of political terror. Galilean blood was spilt at a place where they offer sacrifices to God. This would have been very shocking and disturbing news. The second event was the collapse of the Tower of Siloam. Again, we don't know the details here or where that tower would have been located, presumably in or near Jerusalem. It was a big enough tower that 18 people were crushed when it fell. Another dreadful tragedy. When terrible things like this happen, people struggle to make sense of it. We search for explanations. Often we blame the victims, assuming that they must have been doing something wrong. Or else we'll blame God, saying, well, God must have some mysterious purpose. We do that, I think, as a way of assuring ourselves, well, those people died because they were doing something bad. I'm not doing anything bad, so therefore I am safe. Jesus challenges that line of thinking. Do you think the Galileans suffered because they were worse sinners than all the other Galileans? He asks. No. We're all bad and in need of repentance. In the same way, we're no better than the people who died when the tower collapsed. The same thing could happen to us at any moment. Thanks for the anxiety, Jesus. Jesus doesn't allow us to cling to simple explanations of suffering. These are difficult situations, and sometimes suffering just happens. Tragedy can be random, and that is indeed scary. In this, I think Jesus and Voltaire agreed. Voltaire was an 18th century philosopher, and a major event that had influenced him was the 1755 Lisbon earthquake. Now, that earthquake happened on All Saints' Day, and approximately 30 to 40,000 people died. People struggled to make sense of that tragedy, and some argued that this was all somehow part of God's plan. Voltaire wrote Candide to challenge that blind optimism that would say everything happens for the best. A series of absurd things happen to the main character, Candide, and his tutor, Pangloss, repeats after every tragedy that they live in the best of all possible worlds. Eventually, it gets ridiculous enough that Candide rejects the easy explanation for suffering. Rather than speculate on reasons for suffering, Jesus turns our attention back to us. The question isn't, why did they die? But rather, how are you and I living? Our time on earth could be just as short as theirs. If any lesson can be learned from these tragedies, it's to ask ourselves whether I am living in harmony with God. Make this a time to reflect on our lives, on the fragility and beauty of life. In Candide, Voltaire concludes that we can't explain why suffering happens. There's no philosophy that will fix it. Instead, we carry on with the work before us, cultivating our gardens. That image he likely got from Jesus, who also concludes with a story about a garden. More on that in the sermon. So when we hear stories in the news today of tragedy and natural disasters, instead of pointing fingers at victims and blaming others for their suffering, let's use it as a moment to be reflective, to be repentant, and to focus on our own lives. Suffering is not always explainable, but how we live in response to it matters. How are we tending the gardens the God has blessed us with.